Here is how to get started with pixel art in Photoshop for absolute beginners. You'll be able to make stuff like this and this. Stage 1, image size. Pixel art can be all sorts of different sizes. Find an image on Google Images that's to the pixelation scale that you desire. Look at the difference between this palm tree and this palm tree. I like this one. I'm going to right click, copy image. In Photoshop, I'm going to do create new, choose clipboard, hit create. Paste that tree in, Control V. In image size, I know that this palm tree isn't 530 pixels high. Next, let's find out how many pixels high it really is. Get your crop tool, which is C on the keyboard, and crop your image down so that it touches the top and bottom of your object. Hit enter. If you zoom in far enough, you'll be able to see these white grids on your chosen image. If you can't see the white grids, go to View, Show, Pixel Grid. Make sure that's ticked. Zoom in, find a part of your object that you know is supposed to only be 1 pixel in size, like the end of this leaf here. It's 6 pixels, so it's been resized by 6 times. So if I go to image size, and I divide the height by 6 with my calculator, we get the height of this palm tree. It's 75 pixels. Let's create a canvas for our own tree. File, new. On the right hand side, make sure it says pixels. For height, give it some breathing room. Let's type in 100 pixels. The width, let's do 100 as well. We can change it later. Stage 2, color palette. Find an image on the internet that has the colors in it that are most similar to what you'd like to use. It doesn't have to be pixel art, but it might help if it is. I'll let the colors in this artist's work. You can copy this image into Photoshop in the same way we just did with the palm tree, or if you're happy with the first image, then we can use that. Let's set this up so that we can sample the colors from this tree. Simply drag the tab for this tree out of the way like this, and the same with the other tab. Drag that out into the dark grey area of Photoshop. You've now got 2 separate windows. Keep the window that you're about to paint in quite large, and keep the window that you're going to sample from quite small. You can use Alt and scroll to zoom out, spacebar and hold, and drag left click to zoom in and out to center your object. We can now color sample from this. Stage 3, painting pixels. Go to your main window that you're going to paint in over here. Let's save it. File, save as, give it a name, leave it as a Photoshop file, hit save. Next, make a new layer. Over here, you can see your background layer. Change the color of the background to not be white. This will cause less strain on your eyes and subconsciously give you more control over your colors later on. Get your paint bucket tool. If you can't see it, click and hold, get the paint bucket. Choose an off-white color. It can be gray, it can be slightly brown. Click fill, that's better. Now make a new layer. The plus button down here creates a new layer. The most important rule of pixel art is to never paint onto the background layer. Let's get the pencil tool. It's hiding underneath the brush tool on the left hand side. Hit B for Bravo on the keyboard. Change the brush into the pencil by clicking and holding. Choose a color for your pencil. To sample a color, you hold Alt on the keyboard. Your cursor will change into a pipette. Move your mouse over to what you'd like to sample from and click. Now let go of Alt. Back in here, you can paint away. To change your brush size, use the square brackets on the keyboard by the letter P. Or hold down Control and Alt and drag your right click on your mouse to change your brush size on the go. If you make a mistake, Control Z is undo. Scribble away. Hit E for the eraser tool. Let's set the eraser tool up to work well with pixel art. If you make a mistake and you have the mode at the top set to brush, it will rub out with a very fuzzy edge. I don't like it. Hit Ctrl Z to undo. Change the mode from brush to pencil. Scale it using the same way that you'd scale your brush. And now you can neatly erase pixels. We've now got a tree in winter. Let's make it summer. We need to add a canopy to this tree. The canvas is too small. It's absolutely fine to change this. Let's click on the crop tool, which is C for Charlie. Drag extra height or width if you need to your document. Hit enter. You may need to zoom out with Alt and scroll wheel. The background's got a black outline around it. No worries. Get your paint bucket tool, hold down Alt, sample your color of the background, go to the background layer, fill it back in, everything's fine. Go back to your tree layer. Hit B for brush to choose the pencil tool. To change the brush shape, at the top of Photoshop, go to the brush in a box. Your brush settings menu should appear somewhere. I'm going to dock it onto my taskbar on the right hand side by dragging it in like that. Click brush tip shape. You can download your own, or you can choose this one here that says 174 on it. This will work well for a tree. Sample a color. Let's make a new layer for our canopy. And if you move your mouse over to your tree, you can see the brush is way too big. scale that down. It looks too samey, so I'm going to undo. Click Shape Dynamics on the right hand side in your brush settings. Increase the size jitter to 75, the angle jitter to 100. In scattering, increase scatter amount to 200%. In color dynamics, click Apply per tip. Change the saturation jitter to 5%. Increase brightness jitter to 5%. Decrease your brush size down to about 10 pixels. Scribble away. Be sure to not touch the edges of your document. If you do, you'll need to uncrop it again. It's a tree in summer. Let's change the color. Make your brush only 5 pixels. Click carefully a few times. It's got some blossoms. Save these brush settings that you've just made for next time by clicking on the plus icon beneath the preview. Give it a name. Hit OK. This brush will now appear in your Brushes tab. If you can't see that, simply go to Window, Brushes, and it will appear in one of your folders here. Let's add some shading to the tree trunk. Hold Control on the keyboard and click on the tree trunk thumbnail of the layer down there. This brings up a selection around the tree trunk. Change your brush back to a hard round brush. You can color pick a darker area from your reference image, or you can just make the color darker yourself. If you make it very dark, I then set the opacity of your brush down to about 25% and change your brush size to about 10 pixels. You can add your own shading to your tree trunk down here. The more you click in a certain area, the darker it will be because of the opacity. To deselect, do Control D or select deselect layers. Now your tree looks a bit more 3D. Let's save that by turning the background off by poking it in the eye and going to File, Save As, choose PNG and type in a good name, hit save, hit OK. Now let's learn how to paint with symmetry. You can close down these documents. If it asks you to save, say yes or no for the reference image. Set up your image for color sampling and your main image like we did before. I'm creating an image that's 120 by 120 pixels. If this happens and your tabs appear in the same one, don't worry, just drag it out like that. Alt and scroll to zoom in. Get your background color, and now we're going to do symmetry. Hit B for brush to get your pencil tool. At the top, there's a butterfly. Click and hold, choose vertical. Don't move this. Hit enter. Make your brush size very small. Choose a color for your brush. I'm going to sample from the image by holding Alt. Make sure your opacity is set to 100%. Now, what you paint on one side of this is reflected on the other. Let's make a new layer. Let's increase smoothing to about 90%. So with smoothing set to 0, it's all gnarly. With smoothing set to 90 or 100, it averages out any problems to create a very smooth result. It might feel like it's lagging, that's all part of the smoothing. If you hold Shift on the keyboard, you can do join the dots like this, which creates perfectly straight lines. If you hold Shift and click and drag, it creates a perfectly straight line no matter where your mouse is. Let's learn how to use the Paint Bucket tool. On the left hand side, you'll see your paint bucket. Hit G on the keyboard. Make sure you can see paint bucket tool and that it isn't the gradient tool. Sample your color and click to fill. Sometimes when you start to fill in certain shapes, you see your paint leak through to the outside of your line art. This is really bad. Undo. At the top, untick anti-alias. Try again. Perfect. Start to fill in your line art with a slightly different color. Be careful not to click on the actual lines themselves, but just within them. You'll notice that symmetry isn't a part of the paint bucket tool. You may notice some areas that have gaps in them like this. If you try to fill them in, it will fill in your whole page. Undo. Sample your line art color again. Hit B for brush and paint that back in. Hit G again for the paint bucket tool. Sample the color you are filling in and paint it back in. Great. Start to add some variation to the different areas of your line art. For glowing areas, be sure to add varying shades like this. If your paint bucket tool starts to fill in your whole shape, you can go to tolerance and reduce it down to something like 5. This means you have more control over the areas that you fill. Start to add in some more details. You can turn smoothing off if you need to for this. For adding further details, you may want to reduce the opacity down, choose a much darker color. Add some shading on the lower edges of stuff like this. To add highlights and shadows, you're going to need to turn off symmetry. So Click on the symmetry butterfly at the top, turn symmetry off, choose a lighter color, set the opacity down to about 40% and paint some highlights onto the areas that need it. And you've got yourself a Star Trek style spaceship. Turn off your background layer, give that a save, hit OK, and you can close that down. And I'm going to create one more document that's 100 pixels in size for this. So create a new layer again. Sometimes it's easier to work with shapes like these. Sometimes it's better to have more control over where your lines are going to go. And for shapes like circles, you can hold shift to create perfect circles, which would be hard to do otherwise. To have control over these for pixel art, choose the line tool, for example, by clicking and holding on whatever shape you see here, or when you hit the letter U for uniform, choose that line tool. Change the mode from shape or path to pixels. Make sure anti-alias is unticked here. This image is 200 by 115 pixels. Let's get the rectangle tool, sample from your reference image, drag out a rough shape. I'm going to go for a sort of steam train thing on here. And you can use shapes to create everything that you need instead of just relying on the paintbrush tool. When using the line tool, you can change the weight of the line at the top up here to something more than 1 pixel if you need. If you're creating something like wheels where you're going to need to copy and paste a lot of detail, I'd recommend creating a new layer, getting the ellipse tool, choose an appropriate color, and if you hold shift, you'll drag out a perfectly proportioned circle. You can then get the move tool from up here to move it around to where you need it to be. If you want this to be bigger or smaller, you're going to need to resize it. This is very important. To resize a shape properly for pixel art, you will need to get your move tool at the top here and tick the box that says show transform controls. Click on your layer that you'd like to resize and resize it. By default, this thing called interpolation is set to bicubic. That means it tries to smooth it out. If you hit enter now, for example, you'll see the edges are all blurry. This isn't good for pixel art. So you have to undo, and when resizing, change interpolation to nearest neighbor. Then when you hit enter, it stays as pixel art. Let's create some detail on this wheel before duplicating it. I'd like to fill in the center of this wheel darker. It might be difficult to do this with another circle. I'm going to choose a darker color, choose my circle tool, and if I try to drag a new one in, it'll be difficult for me to get it in the exact center of this. So instead, I'm going to hold Control on the keyboard, click on the thumbnail for my circle layer, and then go to Select, Modify, Contract. I want to have a border of about 2 pixels around the edge of this wheel. Hit OK. If this was to be hollow, you could hit Delete on the keyboard and you've got a ring. I'm going to instead simply get my pencil tool, choose a darker color, increase my brush size and scribble that in. Let's say I want to reduce the size of that again. Select, modify, contract, this time by 5 pixels. I'm going to sample the outer color again and fill it in. I'm then left with this shape. Select, modify, contract, this time by 7 pixels. Get my pencil tool, hold Alt to color pick from the outer area again and fill it back in like this. Let's deselect that with Control D. Let's add some spokes to this wheel. You could use the line tool for this with the weight set to 1. Or if you wanted to be creative, you could get your pencil tool, go to your butterfly and go down to where it says mandala and increase the segments to as many spokes as you need. I'm going to just change mine to 8 for now. Move the mandala shape over to the center of your wheel. Sometimes it's impossible to get it into the center because of the pixel size, but it's worth a try and you can end up with results like this. It's quite fun. You can create any shape using this tool. Turn symmetry off. Before we duplicate our wheel, let's get the pencil tool and add a slight sheen over the top. I'm going to reduce the opacity down a bit and just get a bit of a highlight up there. If you want to turn the pixel grid off, go to View, Show Pixel Grid, and then you can see the detail without being interrupted. Next, let's move this wheel into place, and when you can resize it then as needed. To duplicate your layer, you can do Control J to duplicate, and to move it in a straight line, you can simply hold Shift whilst moving it to keep it in a straight line. Another way to duplicate is to hold Alt on the keyboard and move it again like that. You can hit Enter after you've done transforming the shapes. And then you can have a go at using a mix of all the tools I've shown you today to add detail. And you've got yourself a futuristic train. Finally, let's set up text to work well with pixel art. Get your text tool from down here, choose an appropriate color from up there, and change the font down to something really quite small, maybe about 30 will work. And if you click once, it just comes up with a sample text. You can choose your font now. I'm going to type in a number. Now you can see in the pixels at the edge of this number, they are all blurry and faded. This is because if you go back to your text tool, the mode is set to sharp. If it's set to anything other than none, the edges will look blurry. Set it to none and it works perfectly for pixel art. You can now scale that down. Remember when scaling to set the interpolation to nearest neighbor. Hit enter when you're happy, and you can do things like adjust the opacity of the layer over there. Great, save that. Now, when saving images for the internet, you're going to need to save it twice. So, let's turn off the background. File, save as, and save it as a PNG. And again, save the Photoshop file as well, just to make sure. So you've got a PNG, that's the small size. You've got the Photoshop file, which is just going to be set to PSD. And if you want to save this to put onto the internet, you're going to have a problem. If you create pixel art and then save it and then hope to simply embed it onto a website, you'll see that you're going to end up with blurry edges like this here. So to stop these blurry edges from happening, all you have to do is go to image size, and set the resample mode to nearest neighbor, and then increase the height of your image to something that's over 1000. Hit OK. You will now appear to have zoomed in very far to your image, so hold Alt and scroll to zoom right the way back out. If you go to View, Show, Pixel Grid, you can now see that each of your pixels is about 8 pixels in size. Once you've resized your image to save for web, you'll notice that your text layer is suddenly a whole lot smoother than everything else. To avoid this, you're going to need to hit Undo, and while it's still in pixel size like this, right-click on the text layer and go to Rasterize Type. Now you can go to image size, put the height back to 1000, and now you're ready to save. You can now do File, Save As, save this as a PNG, and I usually like to type in the number of the height that I typed in. I typed in 1000, so I'm going to type in 1000 in there, or you can type in the word web if that helps, and then hit save. If you want to go back to editing your image in pixel art again, you're going to need to undo the scale of your canvas. So do Ctrl Z and your canvas should then reduce in size once more. You're now free to use all of the other Photoshop features to create changes to your image. For example, you've got hue and saturation with Ctrl U. If you select the right layer, hit Ctrl U, and then you can adjust the hue so that your stuff is whatever color you want, and things like that. Hopefully this helped. You've now learned pretty much everything you need to create awesome pixel art for cool graphics or computer games.